Hey everyone, Wazoo here with another Wazoo Web Bytes video, and this time we're going to be looking at Spring Security with JDBC Database Authentication. Yes, a lot of people have been requesting this, and I think I've finally been able to put something together that hopefully helps explain how to do and how to hook up, configure JDBC Authentication with Spring Boot Security. So in front of us, we've got our demo app that we're going to be putting together. This is just going to be a 3-page application, really simple. The home page here, as you'll see on localhost port 8080, is just going to be a page welcome to all users. So the idea here is that this page is open for anonymous access, meaning that anyone who comes to the website will be able to see this page. You don't need to log in for it. And then we'll be having a /user endpoint, and you're presented with a login form from Spring Security. And for a user, the login is user with password of password. And then we'll see welcome to user or admin users. So the idea here is that the user endpoint is available for either user or admin roles, so user or admins. And to log out, I don't have any link available on the web page to click to log out, so we simply just use /logout to log out. And then let's say we want to go to the admin endpoint. And so the username to get into admin is admin and password. And now this is an endpoint that only admin users can see. So if I try and go to the user's endpoint, so /user, I can also see it because the admin user has both the user and admin roles. And let's log out, and I'll show you what happens when you're a user and you try to go to the admin endpoint. So let's try and get to the user, and you'll be prompted with a username sign-in form. And so let's again use user and password. And then let's try and get to /admin, and we won't be able to. So that's our demo application that we're going to be putting together. We're going to be using the H2 built-in in-memory database to track everything, and we'll start from the ground up in terms of adding JDBC database authentication. I think this is going to be really cool. Let's get started. Okay, as with all of our other projects, let's get started at start.spring.io. And we'll be using a Maven project, Java. Let's use version 2.73. And let's see, for an artifact, I think I'll just use Spring Boot Security, JDBC Security. And then let's go ahead, we'll keep it a jar file. Let's use Java 18. And for some dependencies, I'm going to add Spring Boot DevTools. I'm going to add Lombok. I'm going to be actually, you know what? I'm not going to add Lombok. Spring Boot DevTools. I'm going to add Spring Web. I'm going to add Spring Data JPA. I'm going to be adding Spring Security. I'm going to be adding Thymeleaf, and I'm going to be adding H2 database. And let's take a look. DevTools, Web, JPA, Security, Thymeleaf, and H2 database. Looks good to me. Let's generate that and download the zip file. We've got a default project set up here, as you might see. And let's make sure let's set up our application properties file with, let's see, application properties. Let's set it up, our H2 properties with our default H2 properties that we've normally been using in some of the other projects that we've done on this channel so far. So let's go ahead and open up application properties, and I'm just going to get, let's set up some defaults here. So server port, we're going to leave it as 8080. I just really like defining it, even though it's automatically a default. We're going to be using some Spring data source properties. We're going to be using, let's see, default data source properties. So we're going to be defining the driver class name, the username and password of admin and password. We're going to define the database platform of Hibernate dialect, H2 dialect. We're also going to be enabling H2 console. So let's drop in the configuration properties we're going to need for that. H2 console enabled and H2 console path. Let's see, is that big enough? Okay, well, let's keep it like this. Okay, so we've got that so far. Now, the other thing we're going to need is if you notice that we're not defining, usually we've got a Spring data source URL property, and that's usually configured to a file database. For now, we're going to leave this out, but we'll be populating that in as we get going. We're just defining sort of a default in-memory database that we're going to be using for some quick tests here. And once we've got that set up, let's set up a welcome controller with those 3 endpoints that we went through in the demo. So in our root folder, let's create a folder called controllers, and then a welcome controller. And let's go ahead and give it a, welcome controller. And let's call it a class, of course. And let's give it a package. Example, Spring, controllers. Okay, and we want to define this as a regular controller annotation because we're going to be returning some, just some HTML templates using Thymeleaf. And so let's go ahead and let's set up some default. Let's use a get mapping of /. We could also use empty. Let's go with empty right now. An empty URL, and let's public string root, and we'll return just an index.html. And so this endpoint will be for anonymous access. So basically everyone can get there. Now let's go ahead and define a user-only get mapping /user and public string user-only. I'll give that the method name of user-only, and we'll return a user.html. And this will be for any account with the user role. And then finally a get mapping with /admin, public string admin only. And this will be for any account with the admin role. So return admin. Oh, and also the user with either the admin or user role. So let's go ahead and what we'll have to do first is we will need to create a, let's go ahead and just drop in those 3 Thymeleaf templates. So in our classes, I dropped this into this should be in the source, not in the target. I don't know why that didn't work. Okay, this file got moved into the wrong. Yeah, let's move it into the right area. Okay. Now let's give ourselves, let's just resolve all these. Okay, so this won't work yet until we create our 3 template files that we're looking for. Let's go ahead and in the templates folder, source main templates. Let's create an index.html and let's create a user.html and let's go ahead and create a admin.html. Perfect. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut and paste some basic HTML there. We've seen this in some of the other projects that we've put together on this channel, but I'll quickly go through the markup here. So our similar doc type markup, and then we define our Thymeleaf namespace, XML namespace, some meta tags, and then just an H1 welcome to all users. So this will be used for anonymous access to our page, as I said before. Okay, so now for the user page, let's go ahead and copy the same thing, and we'll just update the text here to read welcome to user and admin roles. Okay, and then in the admin HTML, let's drop in some welcome to admin role users. Well, just admin roles. Welcome to admin roles. There we go. So we've got 3 templates set up, which we've seen before. So far, nothing here should really be new to you. We've defined our templates. We've defined a welcome controller that responds to these templates, and we've set up some basic. Where did it go? I must have put it in the wrong properties file. Oh my goodness. Okay. So in the source main resources application.properties, that's where we want to put our stuff. I'll go ahead and recut and paste that in. And remembering to copy out or comment out the data source URL. Okay, so now we should have everything set up, and by default, Spring Security will force itself on all of the endpoints of your application, meaning that it will lock down your entire application by default. So if we start up the server right now, no matter what URL we try to use, Spring Security will inject itself and pop up a login form for us. So before we demonstrate that, let's go create a web security config. So in the source main Java com example, Spring Boot JDBC security, basically our root application, let's create another folder called config. And then within config, let's call it WebSecurityConfig. Okay, and then thankfully Spring Boot or Visual Studio Code fills that stuff in for us. And then what we're going to be needing to use is the enable web security annotation and the configuration annotation. And then what we want to do is, whoa, okay, sorry, we want to extend the web security configurer adapter, which you might notice right here is deprecated in Spring 2.7. So once Spring Boot 3.00 comes out and these Spring Security classes are more solidified and make it past the not beta, but the testing stages that they're in now, then we'll be, I'll provide some updated content to go through those. But for now, we're using Spring Boot 2.7. So this is the way we configure that. Okay. So first, what we're going to need to do is define a a configuration. So using the override, let's override the protected void configure HTTP security throws exception handler. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to be calling, we want Spring Security to try and handle authorization on all of our requests. And we want to create some ant matcher statements to define what kind of role security matches what kind of endpoint. So we set up an ant matchers with a /admin, and this will be for has role admin. Okay, and then we set up another ant matchers with /user, and these will be for has any role of admin or user. Notice the admin and the user all in caps. Okay, and then what we want to do is set up an ant matcher for the default slash, and we want to permit everyone, so permit all. Then we want to set up a ant matcher to allow the H2 console access. So /H2 console /* and permit all. So we want everyone to be able to access that. Okay, and then we want an and method and form login method, followed up by an and form logout. So this basically just means that we can or just logout, sorry, not form logout. So what this will do for us is Spring Security will process, it will enable the default form login handling through Spring Security, as well as the default form logout handling. So when we use the /logout URL, then it will make use of the default logout Spring Security methods. And we've got two more things to add just to allow proper logging in and logging out of the H2 console. So we want to just disable CRF, and we want to take the headers, take the frame options, and disabling those. So now what we need to do, we've got our ant matcher set up to monitor these endpoints, /admin, /user, the default homepage URL, and the H2 console URL patterns, and monitor them and apply the role permissions to those URLs. So let's go ahead, and we need to override one more method to enable the JDBC authentication. Sorry, the JDBC authentication. So let's define another override, and it's another configure call. Configure method, only it's the authentication manager builder. And I think it also throws an exception. Okay, so all we need to do is throw it over to the JDBC authentication. Whoops. JDBC authentication. And back in our, I just want to double check our POM.xml file that we have. Okay, we don't have the JPA. I did forget one to define one thing there. We need to define the starter JDBC. So under starter web, we can drop in a dependency for Spring Boot starter JDBC, and that'll provide some of the JDBC methods for us that we're going to be using. Okay, so back to WebSecurityConfig. All of the source code for this will be available in the description down below. I'll post it to my GitHub, and then you can follow along with what we're doing. Okay, so far we've got everything set up in JDBC Authentication. Now, because we're using sorry about that. Visual Studio Code loves to pop up all these hovers. Because we're using in-memory database, what's called an in-memory database via the H2 database, what we need to do is link up our authentication manager builder with a SQL data source. So this would be, for the moment, this is going to be the in-memory H2 database, but this will also be a handle to your MySQL database or any other database that you're using for your application. So let's use the auto-wired annotation again, and let's set up a data source to data source. Let's see, did it come up with the right data source? Okay, and let's resolve that, and it's going to be going to the Java SQL. So for an in-memory database, which again is what I'm saying that we're using here, we would have to also define a way of wiring up an instance of this data source to that external database that we would be using. But since we're using an in-memory database via H2, when Spring Boot starts up, it'll automatically create an instance of this data source, and it'll inject it into this security config object. So back in our configure method, we're calling JDBC Authentication, and then we're going to be we'll attach it with a data source. And so far, so good. Now, remember what we didn't define a file database in the application.properties. So what we're going to do, just to speed things up, or not speed things up, just to demonstrate the in-memory and default database authentication that Spring Security gives you, we'll also be using a default schema. So Spring Boot comes with its own built-in schema that it uses of users and authorities, which you can tell it to use if your database is completely empty, which ours is right now. AKA a brand new application, we don't have an existing table structure. So let's use the with default schema method there. And then let's create two users that we'll use to start up with. So let's call the with user. And within this function, we're going to define a user with username user and a password of password, and it will have a roles of user. Okay, and then let's go ahead and resolve that. We need the user details. Okay, and then let's call another with user to handle the admin side. So user dot with username admin with a password of password and roles of admin. And let's see. I think we can also use two roles there. Yeah, because it's a user and admin. Okay, so then let's end this off. So here's what we're going to be doing. So just to recap what we've done, we're taking the authentication manager builder that Spring Boot Security will inject into this object, and then we're calling the JDBC authentication method. We're passing along a data source with our data source being, which is going to actually be just the in-memory instance of our H2 database. Now, because we don't have any existing schema, we're going to use a method called with default schema, which will tell Spring Boot Security to make use of its own internal default schema of users and authorities. And then we're going to be creating two users in memory. So with the with user method of user and password with the role of user, and then another with user declaration of username admin and password with the roles admin and user. So we're almost done. We can almost start it up. So let's go back down to further down in this method, and what we need to do is override the password encoder that we normally need to define in Spring Boot security. So let's use the annotation of bean and public password encoder get password encoder. Whoops. And then let's return a no-op. So we want to return a no-op password encoder get instance. So when Spring Security is looking for a password encoder for looking through, or not for looking through, but for handling password management of these accounts that we've set up, it'll just be using the plain text password that we've defined here instead of looking for any other encryption method. Okay, so let's start. We should be able to start things up right now. So let's go into our Spring Boot dashboard. Let's start this up. And let's go through. Okay, the startup logs look okay so far. So our server is listening on port 8080. And if we scroll a little bit further up here, we're going to find an actual in-memory address. Here we go. H2 console available at /H2 console. Database available at JDBC :H2 mem, and then the string of text. So that's what we're going to do once we log in first. So let's first go to, let's just make sure the home page works. Okay, beautiful. We've got welcome to all users. Okay, so let's go to the user page and log in with user and password. And that works. So welcome to user and admin roles. And then let's go ahead and use the /logout. Okay, we've logged out. And then let's log in with admin and password. And maybe I put in the wrong endpoint. Okay, there we go. There we go. Welcome to admin roles. So that looks really great so far. So let's log out of this. And then let's look at what is built for us automatically in the database. So let's go to H2 console. And we can see here our driver class of org.h2.driver and our JDBC URL, which in a previous video, this is what the JDBC URL was. But if you remember that I pointed this out in our startup log, that we've got a JDBC H2 memory address, let's go ahead and put that in there. And then our username is admin and password of password. So let's connect up. And now we can see that by starting up, Spring Security has populated our database with an authorities table and a users table. So we've already got two authorities. We've got admin has both the role admin and the role user authorities. And the user has a role_user authority. So let's go ahead and take a look at the users table here. And we can see that we've got a user, two users in there, which we've created. A username of user, a password enabled is true. And same thing for admin password true. So that looks really excellent so far. That's pretty awesome. So far, so good. We've got everything set up. Spring Security will create a default schema for us, and we're off to the races with some default users that we can use and some roles that we can play with when we need to secure endpoints or pages in our application. But now, what happens when we want to move on to quote-unquote a real system? So if you're dropping Spring Security into a real system where you've already got a users table, let's say you've got something that's called accounts that's not users. well, before we talk about that, okay, so let's say we want to create our own authorities and users table instead of using the default Spring Security default schema. So let's go back into our WebSecurityConfig configure method here, and let's finish things up, or let's comment out the with default schema and the two with user methods. Okay, so we've got a data source declaration here, and so what we want to do instead of using the default schema, the built-in default schema of Spring Security, we want to create our own. So if we create in the same folder level where the application properties file lives, so in the oops, not that one, the real one. Let's go to this one. So source, main, resources, application properties. In that same folder, let's go ahead and create a schema.sql file. So schema.sql. And then what we can do is, by default, the internal Spring Security default schema that populated for us is right in the Spring documentation. So here it is right here. Hopefully this comes up properly. So all we're going to do is we're going to cut and paste this SQL right into our schema.sql file. Because we're working with the H2 database, this is valid syntax, and we won't have any issues. Now, what I normally like to do is before we create the tables, I like to put in some drop statements if they already exist. So if we're restarting our application, then let's start from scratch and drop existing tables before we recreate them again. Okay, so we've got a default schema property here, and this is the same thing in previous applications. What we've done is we've used the Spring Data JPA Hibernate Hibernate package to convert entities in our application to the actual database tables. So this is kind of going the other way around. So instead of declaring entities in our application, we're actually declaring the schema SQL statements to create these for us. And within the same folder, we also need a data.sql file. So let's go ahead and create that, data.sql, and this will create those two users as well as the authorities that we're going to need. So this is what this will do is this will replace the, remember in some of the other applications we've written, I've used a command line runner object to create some default seed objects using code. So instead of going that method and using code, we can use actual SQL and have the application insert these into the database for us. So pre-population, basically. So what we've got is an insert into users table with username, password enabled, with values of user, password, and true. And then we're doing the same thing for the admin user account. Then we're creating two entries into the authorities table with the user role, or the username, and a role user of the role authority, and the same thing for admin. And I realize we need to insert another one for admin and role user. There we go. So that way, when our database starts up, it will run the schema.sql, it'll create those two tables, and then it'll run the data.sql and run these statements to create these two user accounts within the database. Let's see. So let's go ahead and let's start that up. Let's make sure this works. Okay, so let's take a look at the logging. So far, so good. Okay, everything looks okay. And then let's go into the H2 console. We're going to have to refresh this. And okay, that immediately we forgot one thing. So in the application properties file, we're going to, instead of leaving it as an in-memory database, we're going to define a data source URL and give it a file path. So /data ./data/demo. And then let's go ahead and start this up. Okay, so it looks like it started up okay, and let's go ahead and pop this open. And okay, let's log in. Let's first declare I'm going to copy in the path. That's what we'll need to log into H2 console. Get rid of this JDBC H2. Okay, so admin and password. Looks good, and we don't have tables. So we have our information schema default table and our users that we created, but no tables. Okay, so let's go back in here, and I think we're forgetting some startups. Okay, so let's, okay. We're gonna need to declare Spring JPA, hibernate, DDL auto, and make use of none. And then we're going to be needing to use spring.sql.init.mode equals always, and spring.jpa.showSQL equals true. Okay, let's try with these three things. So show SQL will it should, once we start using SQL, it should be showing them in our console. The init mode will make sure that we're always using our SQL schema and data scripts on startup, and declaring a DDL auto of none for hibernate means that we want to use our embedded, or not embedded, we want to use our scripts instead of using hibernate to populate our database objects. Okay, so let's start this up again. And let's make sure this works okay. So far, so good. Okay, and let's go back and re-log in, sorry. Okay, cool. So now we've got authorities, an authorities table with the admin having our two roles and our user having the user role. And then our user table also has the user and password fields enabled. So that looks really good. Now, what happens in a situation where you might have a different username, like a different user table in your application, or different authorities? So instead of an authorities table, you've got like a roles table, and instead of a users table, you have like an account table. So what we can do, we can configure Spring Security back in our WebSecurityConfig. We can config this here. We can pass in some actual queries that we can run. So we can use a method called users by username query, and then we can pass in a query. So in our case, we can use a select username password enabled from the users table, where username equals question mark, because question mark will be what Spring Security will automatically inject into this query. And then we also have a authorities by username query. And we can do here a select username authority from authorities, the authorities table, if I can spell that right, where username equals question mark, because question mark will be, again, populated by Spring Security automatically. So this way, we can create queries to reference any table that you'll have in your application. So like I said, maybe your table is called accounts, or maybe your authorities table is called roles, that kind of thing. So Spring Security gives you a flexible way of passing in a valid SQL statement to do that mapping between roles and your role objects. So we can go ahead and restart this. Shouldn't see any issue because we're still using our default table structure and everything, but we've also declared these username query overrides. Okay, so that looks like it started up okay. So let's try and go ahead and log in again just for fun's sake. So our login or our home page works okay. And the user page, we get prompted with a user login form, so we can use user password, and that looks okay. And then we can do /logout, and then /admin will prompt us with challenge us with a login form, so we can use the admin and then password fields, and then we get our admin page. So that's really all I wanted to go through. I think that's a really cool way of a really cool flexibility way that Spring Boot Security gives you for handling JDBC authentication in your app. I really hope this made sense and this provided some clarity on how Spring Boot Security works, at least in terms of JDBC authentication. I think this was a fun little way to demonstrate how you can play with that interaction and that mapping between your application objects to provide your own JDBC authentication. That's it for this video. If you liked what you saw, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel for more, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace, everyone.